So you mentioned the Tower of Babel, and I do think that this is a particularly relevant text for understanding the potential downfall of technology, but really more broadly, human ambition and achievement.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to note before I get into this that as we have gone through this season of the podcast, I have been so struck by how often it brings us back to Genesis.
Mm.
It seems as if everything that we discuss is dealt with in a comprehensive way in just a few lines of text in Genesis. It's as if we could understand this book, we could understand life itself. And here's another example of 9 verses that have inexhaustible insights about technology and human pride and achievement.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to read it real quick since it is so brief.
Okay.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now I just want to pause there and note that this follows the account of the flood, after which, when God delivered Noah and his family, he commanded them to multiply and disperse over the face of the earth. And you can see that the people building this city here are not interested in that.
Yeah, it's immediately you see disobedience. So that's the first key here, but go ahead.
And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over all the face of the earth. Okay, I'm not going to pretend to know absolutely what this means, but I do see a lot of interesting things here. Now, obviously, the Lord confusing the language of the people was a form of punishment for their disobedience, but also it strikes me as an act of mercy, in a sense, because we can very easily destroy ourselves with our own creations, and we do that multiple ways. First of all, we do it by worshiping what we create. You know, when you look at idols in the Bible, you don't necessarily see people worshiping the sun or worshiping the moon or the water. Did people do that? Yes, absolutely. But it seems like what the Bible singles out more particularly is people worshiping idols made with human hands. Mm-hmm. Things that we craft ourselves, we then want to worship rather than God, who crafted us and from whom the ability to craft things at all comes. So that's one thing. The other thing I see here is the fact that the whole world at this point, the descendants of Noah, were one people. And my mind immediately goes to globalism. Mm-hmm. And one thing that technology has done is, as you say, shrunk the world. I can now talk to someone on the other side of the world as if he were sitting across from me like you are now. Mm-hmm. Now, as we're going to get into later, that might not be as high resolution and interaction as the one that we're having right now. But alas, it's close enough, right? Mm-hmm. The world is being connected in such a way that socially and politically, many would have us move towards a single global society. And I would dare say that those who are trying to do that are probably not very well motivated. Now, I'm not against alliances between nations. I'm not an isolationist necessarily, like all that political stuff. I'm not trying to get into all that. I'm just saying there is a danger when the whole world is one society that I think this story is trying to warn us about.
Well, if you look at this story, if you take it at the very just base level, God said, be fruitful, multiply, disperse across the world. They said, I think we got a better idea. Let's don't do that. Let's come together and stick together, and let's build this tower. Well, it says a tower that reaches into the heavens or reaches into the sky. Most commentators, if you read that and get down to the base level of what they were doing, most commentators believe that they were building a temple of some sort. Mm-hmm. It was not a dwelling place, but a temple of some sort in order to worship, and it was not to worship God. It was a temple that would have been idolistic in some form or fashion. We don't have the details. We don't need the details. The bottom line is that they chose to do something that was new, as far as we know in the Bible, bricks and mortar. It doesn't seem like a real technological advance, but baking clay into bricks, putting it together with mortar was a technological advancement. And they said, hey, we can use this for our own purposes outside of the purposes of God. Mm-hmm. We are going to thwart the purposes of God. Mm-hmm. And so that's the base level. And I think that's what we have to look at is when we start to talk about technology. Are we trying to use technology to thwart the purposes of God or to advance the purposes of God? Mm-hmm. Is it in alignment with what God has told us to do, or is it against what God has told us to do? And I think here people were really trying to make their own gods and to find a replacement for God. And I think that's what we've done with technology. We've become so smart that we don't think we need God anymore.
Right.
If we have a question, we just Google it. If we're sick, we get on, MayoClinic.com or whatever and say, well, let's find out what's wrong with me, and they'll tell me what to do. We're not taking our needs to God. We're not studying and searching the scriptures to see how we live life. We're mm-hmm. letting Google and Apple and Facebook, Meta, which we'll talk about that a little bit, but that's, we're letting those people determine the direction our lives take rather than what God has spoken to us and told us. A lot of times we're not even asking him. We're using our own intellect mm-hmm. and our own logic, our own rationality to decide these things mm-hmm. rather than searching the scriptures to see what God's commands and directives to us are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that power that technology affords us is an illusion. The Bible talks about the deceitfulness of riches. Mm-hmm. Well, we are rich in technology. Technology has rendered us wealthy, such that, things that were once reserved for the richest of people are now owned by the poorest.
Yeah.
This is kind of the way of things. And with that kind of wealth comes this false sense of security that we need to be very aware of. And I think that you're right to single out this phrase, a tower with its top in the heavens. I think that might be the key phrase in the entire story. It's the idea that we can, through our own machinations, reach up to heaven itself. We can meet God
on our own terms.
Yes, that's it. That's it. We can get there. See, our relationship with God in the Bible is mediated by covenants. And the covenants, the terms of those, are always determined by God. You never see man making a covenant with God. Now, man might try to bargain with God here and there in the Bible, but the covenants, which are the medium through which we relate to God, we as New Testament believers are under the new covenant. That is what determines how we relate to God. Mm-hmm. Those are determined, and rightfully so, by God. When we try to say we can reach heaven, or as it might be confused, we might reach utopia through these technological advancements, then we are warping the structure of reality that God has passed down to us.
Yeah, and I think you hit on it right there. We're striving for some idealistic utopia that does not, cannot, and will not exist outside of eternity. You know, we live in a fallen world until Christ returns and sets all things right, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. We're not going to experience that. Mm-hmm. But we have this idea that if we will communicate enough, bring the world together enough, that we will create this little utopia that we can all live in. Mm-hmm. And that is totally not reality. And I think that's what the Tower of Babel people here were basically saying is, look, we're all together. Why would we disperse? Why would we be obedient to what God's telling us to do? Let's just keep our little bubble intact. And we can create our own little utopia, and we can create our own temple and our own way to get to God, and, you know, it'll all work out. And basically what God did is he came down and said, no, that's not the plan. I'm sovereign God, and I'm going to now forcefully disperse you. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's what he did. And by doing so, his intent was accomplished, mm-hmm. right? And so, you know, I think the kind of the question may be pertinent to us is, what are we trying to accomplish culturally and as a society which purposes of God are being thwarted? Mm-hmm. You know, mm-hmm. I would encourage people to look at the technology that we're employing and asking ourselves, are we really moving closer to utopia, or are we moving further away? Mm-hmm. You know, we're communicating more and more with each other, but it's not helpful communication. And so it's a complex topic, mm-hmm. but, you know, I think we're never going to come together in one world government or in unity around the world. It's not going to happen.
Yes. The Lord intended good for humanity by dispersing them. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That was not just some arbitrary decision on his part. When human groups exceed a certain number, they tend to destabilize. This is an argument that some people will make against megachurches. Mm-hmm. They'll say that you can't really have a functional community past about 200 people. And some people will argue that once a church exceeds 200 people in membership, they should split up. Mm-hmm. And some people do that. We're not here to talk about that today, but the point is, this sort of globalist, new world order, utopian vision mm-hmm. does not appear to be what God intended. And why? What's the problem? Why doesn't that work? And it just seems to me that it's what we've already said. The problem of sin is always going to be with us as long as we are human. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah, it would work if we were all under God's authority and we all recognize that God was the ultimate authority and we all agreed to live by his principles and his commands. But the Old Testament paints a clear picture for us in the nation of Israel that the likelihood of that happening is zero. Because we're fallen. Ultimately one of us decides that we want to be in charge, and we then bring havoc upon the nation, and we just choose to go our own way. Mm-hmm. And so I guess relative, kind of trying to bring it back specifically to technology, There's nothing wrong with being able to communicate around the world. I communicated with somebody in South Africa just today. A few weeks ago, I got on a plane and went 8,500 miles to South Africa. That's enabled by the technology of air travel. Those things are not bad in and of themselves, but when we have an expectation that we're all going to come together and unite, and that's not feasible.
The Bible says, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." There is this idea of redeeming the creation, of bringing about heaven on earth. Now we know that the world is fallen and heaven is in the hereafter. However, I do think that it is worthwhile contrasting the idea of heaven and the idea of utopia. What is really the difference? Heaven is where God is on the throne. Utopia is where man is on the throne.